Hey everyone, welcome back. Put yourselves in the shoes of a first responder, whether military, medical, or police, or any other. You may have had a very, very long, stressful day. You might be running on fumes at the end of a huge shift, and you come into contact with a UAP, either by a call to an emergency or by one appearing directly to you. What would you do? Are there any things you should be aware of? Are there any threats? Are there any hazards? Are there any common behaviours or features? Well, fortunately, a great friend of mine, Chris Husing, has gone to the trouble of putting together a presentation in order to give you what you need to know. And I'm honoured to say that he chose my channel to present it. He's worked in collaboration with some of the most phenomenal minds in both military, aviation, police, and other emergency services, and put together a brief presentation to give you an overview of what you might expect. So I really hope you enjoy it. If you feel like this was worth a coffee, then there's a link down below, and let's get into it. So, Chris, it's great to have you on, man. I know we've been talking a bit before, and I'm really, really excited. You've done some phenomenal work on this. So, before we dive in, why don't you tell us a little bit about you and how you got sort of started in this field?
Well, I'm a California guy, and I have to go back all the way to the beginning where, I don't know if you remember, in 1980, they released that really cheesy science fiction movie, Hangar 18.
Yeah.
Which I definitely recommend. It's on YouTube for free. It's cheesy as all get out, but it's kind of one of those, so bad it might be good kind of movies. And my mother, who her first job out of high school was as a secretary, civilian secretary for an Army units in Michigan. And she was stationed or posted to a unit that had Nike SAM missiles, which were nuclear tipped. They were designed to defend the United States airspace from Russian bomber attack. So we're talking a very serious unit here. Very sober. And so when this movie came out, she said, a lieutenant came on my desk one day and told me the United States had recovered a flying saucer in the Southwest. And there were bodies that were 3 to 4 feet tall with no hair. The Roswell story, and this is 1979, 1980, nobody was talking about Roswell. No one was talking about crash UFOs. And the fact that in 1962, a lieutenant in the Army is telling her this story, but it asks all sorts of questions. When I was in high school, one book that really affected me was Above Top Secret by Timothy Good. Now, some of the cases he presents have been debunked, but he has a lot of declassified government documents, which I think was groundbreaking in the study. So I've always been interested in the military and aerospace issues and military history. So I got a job actually out of college with the U.S. Air Force as a civil servant historian. And on the course of that job, one day, we would have regular staff meetings to discuss what happened at the command staff meeting. I was at headquarters Air Force Reserve at Robins Air Force Base in Georgia. So my boss, the deputy historian, my boss had gone over to the base to take part in the briefing because the historian sat on the battle staff. And he came back and he told us what we needed to know for writing the history, the things we should be aware of, events, operations. And he started laughing at the end of his briefing and he says, one of our air crews overseas saw a UFO. And I'm like, what? It's like, did I hear that right? And so I didn't know what to say, and I was really stunned. And he was not a UFO guy. Both my bosses made clear they didn't believe that subject whatsoever. And I said, what was the reaction in the room when this was briefed? And he said, laughter. So I've been trying to hunt down that incident ever since. And I have to say, probably about the 2010s, I kind of lost interest in the topic. There was really no developments happening. There was, I started to think that maybe what the Wall Street Journal just published about these being military covers for black projects was probably the main answer for most of these sightings. Mm-hmm. But then the 2017 New York Times article got me back interested in the subject again. And I've been following all the developments since then. I mean, it's a subject I never really let go of, but just kind of put on the shelf for a few years. So when the Soul Foundation was formed, partly by Dr. Gary Nolan, I remember this time when I was in the archives. I transferred from Georgia to the headquarters Space and Missile Systems Center at Los Angeles Air Force Base, which is now part of the Space Force, but back then was still Air Force Base. And I'm in our archives one day, and there's a folder that says UFOs. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. What's inside this folder? And all it was the fact sheet that the Air Force has put out on Project Blue Book and UFOs, which is, very, it's talk about how many cases Blue Book investigated, what the results were. But on the end of it, it says that civilians that are wanting to make a UFO report should refer it to their local law enforcement. And my first thought was, that's kind of strange. I mean, what's the cops supposed to do? Are they going to write a speeding ticket or something? And, how are the police going to react to these reports? Are they even aware that the government has referred them to law enforcement? And then I looked at the FAA's website recently, and the same thing. It's referring the public to their local law enforcement. Wow. Now, my dad was career law enforcement. I can tell you that nobody in any major or minor American law enforcement organization is aware that the FAA and the Air Force are sending the public to them to make reports. So I wrote to the Soul Foundation and said, if you're going to do public policy, you need to get some policy for law enforcement, because they're not aware of this and they're not prepared. They're not knowledgeable in the subject. They probably think it's bunk. So I never got a response back from Soul Foundation for whatever reason. So I thought, well, the hell with it. I'll do it myself. I'll try to come up with something that I can present. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And I asked, when my father has these monthly meetings with this law enforcement organization in the San Francisco Bay Area where I live. And I said, Dad, can you ask them if I could give this as a trial run? And I thought they would say, oh, no way. We don't want your son talking about that. But they were like, yeah, come talk about it. And they had tons of questions. The number one question I want to know is like what I thought the origin of these objects was. Mm-hmm. And I kind of didn't want to talk about that because I wanted to look at it from a neutral standpoint rather than give a bunch of origin theories, which I've done a separate presentation I'm still working on right now because so many people keep asking me, what do you think is the origin of UAP? Mm-hmm. So I don't pretend to be a law enforcement official. I'm a former Air Force historian. I think I know a lot about law enforcement because of my family's connections to it. I'm not saying this presentation is perfect, but it's my first shot. And if anyone's got feedback or comments, I'd be happy to hear that and make it better.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And but the thing is, it is such. If you put yourselves in the shoes of law enforcement, I mean, we know from things like these New Jersey drones that we've been seeing. The law enforcement there are just at work doing a normal day, and next thing they're presented with something that they've got absolutely no training for. It's the same with like the Vandenberg Air Force Base guys. There is no playbook for this, it seems. So I think
there isn't. And think about, I don't know if you saw the video a couple years ago of the supposed crash in Las Vegas, mm-hmm. and the body cam, the two cops, they took it seriously, but they kind of seemed kind of frightened, and I don't blame them. They didn't know what they were walking into, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah, exactly. And when you can't, I mean, you're worrying about obviously what's in front of you, but then you're thinking, well, can I radio this in? Are they going to take us seriously? What are the steps? There's procedure for everything from chemical spills to aircraft crashes to all these different situations that an officer could encounter on shift. But nothing for this, it would appear. So yeah, I think this is a fantastic piece of work that you've done. And I think it could help a lot of people. So shall I open it up and we'll
yes, sir. Please do so.
Yeah. Okay.
And there's been some people that have done some work that in much greater detail, which will probably come to light later. And that's great. This is mostly just to start a conversation with any law enforcement organization that,
Exactly. I think it's just the more the better. There's no harm in more data, and you've done such a great job here of putting together. It's like a keynote speech, for anybody that perhaps isn't involved in the field that wants to be. So,
or they get thrust upon them.
Exactly. You go on to shift and you don't know what you're going to bump into.
So this is basically introducing my credentials to talk on this subject. Unfortunately, my career took place in the pre-digital camera age, so I don't have too many pictures. Although that's me at Robins Air Force Space Museum. Mm-hmm. In front of a plane that my great uncle flew in Vietnam and Laos. So that was pretty cool.
That's awesome. Yeah,
pretty awesome. So like I said, I was at Headquarters Air Force Reserve and then at Headquarters Space and Missile Systems Center. I talk about the classified briefing I got on the UAP in 1996. I've given evidence to Aero, although that was disappointing. And my father, like I said, career law
Yeah,
enforcement.
before we dive in, I've got to ask, what was your experience with Arrow then? Because we keep hearing some people have a great one and other people obviously not.
Well, I was naive because I thought that the 2017 New York Times article might make the government more receptive to talking about this subject. So my first thought was, I've got to get a hold of Arrow. And I tried my senators, my congressmen. I wrote the Deputy Secretary of Defense. I wrote Senator Gillibrand. Nothing, no way. And then I found Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick on LinkedIn. But I had to pay like $36 to get the higher membership level to talk to him. And he said, "Here's the email address. Don't put your testimony in this email." And I got a call from a lieutenant colonel in the Army who gave me his last name and not his first, and said, I may have to come out and interview personally if this is still classified. And then he got back and said, "Nope, I talked to an OSI agent, Office of Special Investigations for the Air Force. And since it's so long ago, it's probably not classified. We can talk about it on the phone." So I told him the story that I had been briefed on. And we talked for about 48 minutes. And he told me, and he had the OSI officer was part of our teleconference. And he said, "I'm going to type it up and I'm going to send it back to you in a week, probably 2 weeks, for you to agree to, the statement, and then we'll file it." And I never heard back from them. So for the first couple of months, I was, people were attacking Kirkpatrick and Arrow on social media, and I said, "Well, I got a pretty fair deal, I think, with them." But as the weeks went by with no response from them, and I even tried emailing them, I started to turn on the whole experience that they weren't all that serious. And I had a pretty good idea they weren't taking me seriously when the colonel said, "We've had great luck going to the National Archives." And I said, "This incident's not going to be in the National Archives. It's going to be at the Air Force Archives or the particular command, the Air Force Reserve Command. That's where the information is going to be." And they didn't seem to have any interest in digging that up. Now, again, I didn't present them a gray body from my refrigerator. It was a second, third-hand story. But you have to remember, this is the time that this briefing happened was in 1996. Long after Blue Book was closed.
Yeah.
So for an air crew to tell their intelligence officer what they saw, and for that to go all the way up the chain to the gaining headquarters, and they got laughter, I thought that was blatantly unfair. So I still am trying to dig up this any details I can on this incident. But I've been kind of thwarted so far. I was able to track down the wing commander who's retired, and he said he had no knowledge of it, but he didn't seem like he was very comfortable talking about the topic either.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's all sorts of suspicions about them, but I mean, you said there this presentation's unclassified, but what are the point of Arrow if they're not actually going to be investigating these things to the best of their ability, because they would have oversight over the Air Force, you'd imagine, so they could look at whatever files still exist. But
what I feel kind of betrayed about is that they made it sound like they wanted historical accounts, and if you've read the historical report they put out, it was a joke. I mean, it looked like a 10th grader in high school compiled it off the internet and Wikipedia. So they really weren't interested. They weren't interested in pursuing historical cases. I've heard anecdotally that there was I think it was Robert Salas. I don't want to get names confused. That he brought a bunch of former Missileer personnel.
Yeah,
and they got blown up also. So
yeah, absolutely. He's Robert Salas. I know has tried to testify to Arrow, and they've just frankly treated him with contempt, and he was a missileer. He was of the highest level of service to the country. So and
his story's been consistent. Every time I've heard him tell a story, there's never any embellishment. It never starts to wander in other directions. It's a pretty succinct account. And there was a window, like I said, after the New York Times article, where I thought that the government would be serious about maybe releasing more details. And I think there is an element in the government that still wants to do that, but there's another element that is wholeheartedly against it.
It's got the lid on pretty tight. Yeah,
exactly. And what that does for law enforcement is it kind of means you're on your own right now.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, my trial audience for this, the officers of my dad's association, was the number one thing was, where do we send these reports? And at that time in November last year, I didn't have an answer, but I have one later in the presentation where they can go now.
Fantastic. Okay, well, we'll dive in. So it represents your views only, and presentation's not meant to be all encompassing. But we covered that at the start, and yeah, this is considering that, as you said, law enforcement are going to be the end of the tip of the funnel for a lot of encounters now. Then this is going to be of great value, I think.
Exactly. I had one of the officers in the audience for the presentation who said, "I've seen strange objects. I just don't know where to go with them."
Oh wow! Well, there
And
you
here's what
go.
I refer to: the FAA and the Air Force. This is their official fact sheets on the subject. It has not changed. The wording on the Air Force website is the same as in 1997 when I saw that document in our archives.
Mm-hmm.
And what's actually, if I can take an aside here, I don't know if you're aware of the American show The Brady Bunch.
Yes.
They do a UFO episode, and it's actually kind of funny because it actually reflects this guidance in the 70s, where Bobby and Peter are seeing UFOs in the backyard, and it gets out of hand. And so Mike, the father, calls the Air Force Base, and they send out a
Right.
cop to.
Okay.
So I thought for a crazy show, they actually had it pretty accurate.
Yeah, it's amazing how much stuff on TV and film is, I think, very, very accurate. But I think that's a conversation for another day. But yeah,
Absolutely.
that's very interesting. So they're kind of off the same playbook, and the playbook's not been updated for a long time.
So this is a basic history. I mean, this again, it would take hours to sit down law enforcement and talk about the whole history of the phenomenon. But these are just some kind of highlights I put. I talk about the idea that they've been around for 1,000 years. Foo Fighters, Ghost Rockets, Kenneth Arnold, the Nimitz encounters. I mean, these are things that you and I are well aware of, but they're not necessarily. And I have a picture of Kenneth Arnold with an object that he claims he saw in the famous Mount Rainier sightings, which I have to tell you, Tom, that looks curious. If you've ever seen a Horton HO229,
Absolutely.
that looks a hell of a lot like an HO229 to me.
I totally agree. I don't want to derail this or like detract from it, but I made a documentary talking about exactly that. Because it was seen very close to the Boeing factory. Boeing at the time was the US's biggest manufacturer of aircraft. And there was 9 of them, and some of them were flying sort of quite erratically. So I speculatively think it was a engine tests, because the ones that they recovered a chassis, and the wings were separate from the warehouse. And I think they were perhaps trying out a few different engines and getting these things in the air, because they got like a year to build it after Paperclip and Operation Lusty, where they recovered it.
But, and remember the official story from the U.S. government is that they brought one of the Horton brothers over to the U.S., but nothing ever came of it, which makes no sense. Anyway, that's neither here nor there.
Yeah.
And then, of course, a picture of the Tic Tac, which I think most people are aware of. And I still think it's very hard to debunk that story, although there's been people who have tried.
Yeah, absolutely right. And it's not alone. And well, that leads us perfectly into this slide, I guess.
Absolutely. So one of the questions my father had is, when I was talking to Arrow, he said, why do they care now? What's happened that makes this a prime subject? And so we talk about the New York Times article, the accounts of the Nimitz pilots, Ryan Graves and his squadron mates, which we've got Lou Elizondo, of course, has been out there in the public, and Ryan Graves, who's really done a lot of great work in this field since he came forward. So that's kind of why now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course, like you said there, the ongoing congressional hearings. We've just had one with Jeff and also the Mr. Wiggins, an active duty naval officer and stuff. So it's
absolutely
it's a clear and present thing that's going on. And of course, Marco Rubio's in this new Age of Disclosure documentary.
Right. So I had a bunch of quotes. I'm thankful to Ryan Graves' organization, Americans for Safe Aerospace, for putting this up. He has probably about 3 web pages of quotes from various officials about the reality of this subject. Senator Rubio, when he was still in the Senate, he made this quote here about advanced objects demonstrating advanced technology and routinely flying over our restricted or sensitive airspace. And I think that's a very key thing, especially when you're talking to law enforcement, personnel. You don't want to talk about abductions. You don't want to talk about alternate consciousness. You don't want to talk about psionics. You want to talk about two nuts and bolts topics while they should be concerned: flight safety and national security.
Yes. Yeah, if you're an officer responding to an emergency, it doesn't really matter where it's come from or what it's here to do. You've got to deal with what's right in front of you, I think.
Now, this is a bit of a rambling quote from the former NASA administrator, Senator Nelson, but he was on an interview with, I think it was University of Virginia, and he kind of rambles through this explanation about how, he's talked to pilots and they've seen what they've seen. So I think that's the only comment I've ever seen a NASA administrator make about the reality of UFOs.
Mm-hmm.
So very curious.
Yeah, very, very, very. There's a long string to pull there for sure.
Now, Scott Bray was one of the initial briefers in the first House hearing. He's now at NATO, as far as I know, but he was the Deputy Director of Naval Intelligence. And I think what's really stunning about this quote is he looked at pilot reports, and there were 11-year misses in 20-year periods. So that's one every 2 years of the period he studied that there was a near miss, a definite flight safety risk.
Wow. Yeah, I know one of the Red Rippers, when Ryan Graves was giving his testimony, they had two Hornets split formation by one.
Yeah, I've heard that story as well. And then John Ratcliffe, who was the Director of National Intelligence, now he's Director of CIA. I was watching, I think it was Maria Bartiromo's show on Fox News, and she kind of ends the interview kind of strangely saying, "Oh, what about UFOs?" And he goes into this long answer about how there's things that they can't explain. I thought, my goodness. And I think I almost said more than he probably should have at this point. And it was such an out of the blue comment, and it's been quoted by other sources, not just me. But I think what he says, they're difficult to explain, movements that are hard to replicate. We don't have the technology for, or traveling at speeds that exceed the sound barrier without a sonic boom. I mean, these are all the fundamentals of the current UAP situation. And for such a high-ranking guy to say that, I can't think of any other official in government, U.S. government, that's made such a statement.
No, and it's also interesting that he says there about we've got multiple sensors picking these things up, because I know all the people that say, "Oh, none of this exists," they will look at one particular piece of footage, but for every fighter plane, there's usually an AWACS and radar support and all sorts picking this up at the same time that we wouldn't necessarily have access to. So it's very interesting. Right.
And then, of course, I think the premier comment that's been made is Barack Obama, the former president. Now, if you look at this quote, it's on YouTube. It's a James Corden Late Show, and he kind of it's another joking question, like, "What about UFOs?" And then President Obama goes off in this quote, and it's like, that wasn't what James Corden was looking for. He's looking for, wacky little green men or something. And then when the audience took it kind of flatly, and President Obama ended the interview by saying, "Well, it's jokey, haha, or whatever." So another president. I can't think of any other president that made such a comment about, we know about these things and we can't explain them.
Yeah, he was certainly very careful with what he said. So.
Now, I won't go through all the investigations because, again, I think most of these are well known. But for a subject that apparently doesn't exist, there's been quite a number of investigations over the last 80 years about it. Project Sign, Project Grudge, Project Blue Book, the Robertson Panel. I mean, these are all well known in the UFO community, but maybe not to the police and law enforcement community. They may not realize that there's been this many investigations of the subject. And that's Captain Ruppelt there, who was a Blue Book commander. Very interesting guy. He wrote a book where he basically expressed frustration with Blue Book's, wholesale debunking. And then just before he died very young, I think 38 years old, of a heart attack. He put out a second edition of that book where he said, "Oh, it's all a myth." So what convinced him to change his mind before he died, I have no idea. But an interesting guy, nonetheless.
Very much so, yeah. I mean, it's interesting enough that this, regardless of the findings of each of these groups, because I know some of them are quite contentious, at some point we saw fit to open up a fresh investigation. So that should tell you something, that, whatever it is, the evidence just keeps pouring in.
So we have forms of UAP. I mean, lights in the sky, orbs, the tic-tac, cigar shape, dome shape, disc shape. I mean, there's any number, and I try to get two better resolution pictures. I'm still looking for better resolution pictures, but the upper one there, the metallic blimp, was taken with an iPhone camera of a Super Hornet F-18F. So the weapons system operator, Rooster and Top Gun Maverick, basically, at the end of the movie, he took it with his iPhone. So it's hard to get a good resolution picture there, but that's one of the better pictures I've ever seen of a UFO.
Yeah.
Whatever it may be, whether it's a drone or, non-human intelligence or whatever, that's a pretty solid picture there. Although I know there's been debunkers. Now, the one in the lower right was actually a photocopy of an email that the Canadians released, where, if you remember, a couple years back, there was an F-22 that shot down an unidentified object over the Yukon.
That's right.
The initial public story was that it looked like the Chinese spy balloon with a balloon and a sensor payload. They never released any more details than that, and I don't think they intended to release this one, but there was a Canadian defense official who said they didn't want to release, or they were reluctant to release this picture because it would cause more confusion, in their words. And the confusion, I think, Tom, is that it doesn't look anything like what we were told that it looked like. That doesn't look like a balloon with a sensor package down below. Now, the Canadian network CTV filed a Freedom of Information request, their version of it in Canada. And I just touched base with Canadian researcher Chris Husing, who said that there's not been any further release. CTV wanted to release the imagery, and they have not responded to that request so far. And I don't think they're going to.
Interesting. Yeah, it's interesting that we would send the most advanced fighter jet officially ever made to shoot down a balloon, in my opinion. But there we are. I think that was it. The Raptors' first confirmed kill was allegedly a balloon.
So. Instead, it looks like a donut that someone took a bite out of.
Yeah.
One thing that I know ATIP has become very contentious in recent months, but I do think that the ATIP, which was the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program under Lou Elizondo, who came out a couple years back with the New York Times, I still think these observables are very important for officers to decide what is really anomalous. What should I take particular attention in? And we have the sudden and instantaneous acceleration, hypersonic velocity without signatures like a sonic boom, low observability, which is meaning about radar. I mean, I've always be able to pick it up. Transmedium travel, which you got a picture in the upper left there of the USS Omaha that tracked that object, which appeared to splash down and left no trace. Positive lift, which means they have no, signs of propulsion or wings or airfoils or rotary wings, and biological effects. And of course, got a little artist concept of the famous 1980 crash landrum sighting, where all three of the witnesses had burns suggesting radiation exposure.
That's right. Yeah, and that's something that Professor Nolan has also done a lot of work on. Is not necessarily first responders, but people that have come into contact with UAP, and some of them have taken damage, which appears to be radiation or ionizing radiation. But this is that. I think it's an important point to make. It's not necessarily a threat, but it's definitely a hazard. Lou Elizondo has said before, if you don't know what a jumbo jet is and you walk behind the engine, you're in for a rough time. And when first responders are coming into contact with these orbs of light or things that may be giving off radiation, that is a potential risk.
My recommendation for law enforcement, if they come into contact with one of these objects, is to get away from it. But I think, to be fair, the human mind, like the witnesses, the one woman that stood outside her car and watched this thing, your mind is curious, right? It's hard to, curiosity killed the cat in this instance, but it's hard to back away. I mean, if I was to see this object like they did, I probably would have stood outside to look at it also,
Yeah. Okay.
Now, here's the roles. These are the roles I've identified with law enforcement. Now, they may not be comprehensive. There may be, suggestions that viewers could make or other law enforcement. It's an evolving document. Mm-hmm. This one sounds kind of stupid, like very basic. The report taker is very important. It needs to be thorough. It needs to be serious. It needs to be an assessment of the witness credibility. Were there other witnesses? This is a document that future researchers and the government are going to rely on once we have a central repository to put them in. Right now there's no civilian organization or civilian reporting mechanism within the airport, or the airports that are FAA. I know there's been talk about the NASA opening up their aviation safety database to such reports, but I don't know if that's been done yet. Do you know?
No, not that I'm aware of.
I don't think it has been done. So, this may have to be held in-house until someone comes looking for it. And also, I think the fact that if witnesses have had such a close encounter, they might be reassured by policemen there to take a report that they've done something about it. I think that psychologically that could be a big factor.
Yeah, and I think you make a great point. I mean, the report taker is essential, especially when we don't necessarily know what we're dealing with. Every little detail taken now will lead to good stuff. And if I might just jump back a second to this one,
sure.
Some of it, when you're taking details of a witness or even a live event like this, these are the things which are very important to note. Was there any sound? Is there any draft of it? Is there all of these little details which could be the difference between identifying it as a conventional vehicle and something extraordinary?
And what's not listed there is also the delete trace evidence.
Yeah,
we're going to talk about a case coming up where we left trace evidence, and that's very important also too.
Absolutely. Right.
And let's see, these are considerations. Credibility should be assessed. And like I always say, anytime I talk about UFOs, 97% of it's got prosaic explanations. And if anyone argues otherwise, then they're not taking this thing seriously. I mean, most of it are prosaic, but we're not interested in the prosaic. We're interested in the anomalous ones. The ones that turn out to be a kite or a weather balloon or an aircraft are not important. But the ones that are really mysterious, like Cash Landrum, like some of the ones we're going to talk about in a little bit, those are the reports that we want to be, thorough and accessible to future investigators.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and especially with the topical stuff about these things that could be drones the size of cars over airports and things like that. I mean, if you can, through diligent questioning and reasoning, determine that this is a drone, then that is a crime in itself, So
yes,
it leads onto a different tree of investigation. But
absolutely,
the way that you've described it here, this allows you to still check if there's that anomalous element. That 3% could be absolutely extraordinary.
It only takes one, like you said, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Now, this is becoming more critical because I wrote this presentation actually before the New Jersey drone swarms. And, law enforcement may be called in by a federal body, Homeland Security, Energy Department, FBI, NASA, Aero, whoever. You may have to provide assistance to federal agencies. And I think they're going to see a lot of this with the drone swarms continue, if they come back in the United States in particular. That they're, I think one of the greatest benefits of police officers being aware of this topic is they're out there as observers. They can provide more data points, and they're really in the front lines of this mystery right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And they do it does seem to occur in what they call flaps, doesn't it? Every few years, or it's seemingly every year at the moment around this time of year, somewhere in the world gets a flock of different sightings. I've just done a European flight, and the night before there was a naval base closed down. There was Sweden and Denmark, and then last year we had RAF Lakenheath, and that's a US Air Force base, and in the UK. So we don't seem to know where, but it's a pretty safe bet that these things are popping up. So,
well, one thing that Timothy Good wrote is he said that as we get farther and farther advanced, the technology between our own aerospace technology and the NHI possible technology is going to get more muddled. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you saw, there was an article yesterday where some drone company in the United States said, "Oh, that was us in New Jersey. We were testing these drones."
Yeah,
maybe, but that doesn't account for the Scandinavian flaps. It seems kind of like a very rushed answer.
Exactly. And if that was true, and they've broken so many aviation and military laws and done incursions over nuclear sites and rocket stations and put so many people at risk.
Picatinny Arsenal and I think Fort Dix or something.
It's such a flippant thing to say. I think it's ridiculous once you actually think of whether that's what he's potentially owning up to there.
Well, I read the article from the New York Post, and I noticed that there's no one's named as a source. It's unnamed and anonymous sources.
Mm-hmm.
So if it is you guys testing new drone technology, why don't you put your name out there?
Yeah, exactly. Plus the vehicle thing that they showed, which is supposed to be responsible, was very wobbly and didn't even have the same light signatures as the things that people have seen. The morphology of these supposed drones that people have been seeing is very varied. So I don't think it's easy to say it's all this one drone that this one company's made. It seems like a bit of viral marketing to me.
I think the takeaway from this slide is basically as we have more drone incursions, I can see law enforcement at the local level being, tapped by federal agencies to provide information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, and then there's also the role of being a witness, and we have the granddaddy of all. I think it's the most compelling UFO incident ever. I've studied it. I think you probably have too, Tom. I mean, I've never seen anyone with a really convincing explanation. And that, of course, is Socorro in April 1964. You got Lonnie Zamora chasing a speeder outside of town. He hears this roar and then sees a flash. And he thought that the dynamite shack from the county, which I guess was a thing back in 1964, had blown up. He terminates the pursuit of the speeder and he drives out to this arroyo and he sees this egg-shaped craft landed with two white occupants, apparently, that were, he said, either short adults or tall children. It freaked him out. And the occupants apparently got back on board. The egg has like these 4 landing pods. They retract. It takes off with a flash of some kind of propellant and then goes off without the propellant and just shoots out away out of the sky. Lonnie was freaked out. I don't blame him. I'd be freaked out too. And his buddy was a New Mexico state trooper. And the state trooper found that some of the brush had been singed, and there were also 4 landing pod marks. And what's really remarkable about this incident is it had so many responding agencies to it. It had, Sergeant Chavez of the state police. State police came out. The first military investigators were from White Sands Missile Range Army. And then Blue Book, Dr. Alan Hynek, the scientific consultant for Blue Book, came out and investigated this. And the FBI, I read recently, also investigated this incident. And the best the Air Force could come up with was that it was a test of a lunar lander, which you have to, first of all, the lunar landing training vehicle, which almost killed Neil Armstrong, if you remember that story. Mm-hmm. That was not, it didn't look anything like an egg, and it wasn't ever meant to be a space faring craft. It was a test craft. And in the lunar lander that landed on the moon, looks nothing like the egg, and also was not made to work in the Earth's atmosphere.
No.
So if it was a lunar lander, why is it still, if it's some kind of classified lunar spacecraft, why has it not been declassified since then?
Yeah.
And what's also curious about this is a bit of trivia is that this is one of the few UFO sightings where he reported an insignia on it, which is kind of that turned up dome over an arrow and like a horizontal line. And I can't think of any other UFO sightings where this well known to have an insignia. Are any that you're aware of?
Only sort of fringe things like what happened at what's the
Rendlesham Forest?
Rendlesham, absolutely right. And there is a sort of legend that on parts of the wreckage from Roswell there was certain symbols and stuff like that.
Right.
But I think most importantly, I mean, just imagine being in Officer Zamora's boots when he starts off responding to a speeding, and then next thing you know, absolute pandemonium happens.
Pandemonium. Also, for the rest of his life, I heard that he eventually got tired of all the UFO people calling him up asking for details. He actually quit the force, and I think before he died, he was running a gas station. He just, he kind of, a lot of witnesses are like this. They kind of think, hey, believe me or don't believe me. I've done all I can at this point.
Yeah, yeah. That's something
I've not been
that
to. Sorry, go
Commander
ahead.
Fravor says. I mean, he says, look, don't just because I saw one, it doesn't mean I'm some UFO expert. He's like, if the people that are asking me about this thing probably know a lot more about it than me. Just happen to be the touch point between this thing and the known world.
What's cool is I've not been to New Mexico, or I've not been to Socorro, New Mexico, but apparently the landing pods, they filled up over the decades, but someone put rocks around them. So you can
Oh,
still go there today and see where the craft, allegedly
oh
landed.
wow.
And they've also made a mural. There's an overpass, and they painted a mural of the whole incident. So I hopefully that his family feels vindicated by that, attention.
Mm.
And and I guess the one weakness of the case is that it's only one witness, but an impeccable witness. And
Well,
officers
exactly.
might be the ones. You might be the one. You might be driving, like you said, on patrol one day, and then you come up with something that you've never dealt with before.
Yeah.
Okay, air support aircraft. I mean, pretty obviously, if you've got a police helicopter, you might encounter UAP directly. One of the officers I talked with to make this presentation said that he would want, like, if he was dealing with the Las Vegas incident where supposedly there were beings in someone's backyard, he'd want a FLIR camera. You want an airborne FLIR asset, so they could be called in on that role also to help try to find wreckage or person or occupants or whatever. And I think I also make a mention about having extreme caution because of flight safety issues. And you probably know this better than I do, but I just looked it up before we got online. In 2008, there was a South Wales police helicopter that encountered an unidentified object and chased it over the Bristol Sound. And then I read that they said, oh, an explanation for that was it was Chinese lanterns from a wedding, which if you're competent police pilot, I think you recognize what a Chinese lantern looks like compared to some unidentified object.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, there's I mean there's in the halls of legend there's all sorts of stories even over the UK of that the Penturk one that you're talking about there of helicopter pilots in particular encountering these things and they can completely outmaneuver you, they move very erratically, so I think the best advice is keep as clear as possible and kind of expect the unexpected.
Right. Absolutely.
But they don't seem to have. There's no historical reports that I'm aware of any collisions taking place. But
there is a strange story. There's a strange story that was on the History Channel's Unidentified series a few years ago, where the Italian Navy was claiming that they had a helicopter shot down by some UAP.
Yes.
But I tried to dig that story up, and I couldn't find any reporting of it.
Okay, I'll send you some information on that. Roberto Pignotti is the world's best investigator on that case.
Yeah, I'd be interested to read more about it.
Yeah, very interesting. Very interesting. That was, I mean, around the Mediterranean that took place over Italy, and
Okay.
yeah, there's been some extraordinary cases there. The Magenta case as well, of course. But I don't want to take us too far off track. But yeah, there is evidence of potential evidence anyway of a helicopter being damaged by what appeared to be directed energy.
Yeah, definitely. And I just added this slide because it dawned on me that there's more and more anecdotal evidence that UAP are using our waterways, our oceans, as either a way to transit to their transmedium capabilities, or there could be a base that they're using, or they're hiding in the water. And we got a really big USO case later in this presentation we'll go through.
Right.
I just recently made contact with retired Admiral Tim Gallaudet. Who was gracious to connect with me, and I said, "Are UAP a maritime threat, not just a flight safety threat?" And he said, "Yes." You could be on a police boat like that one there, and you might see strange lights under the water.
Mm-hmm.
Something might come out of the water. We've had tons of anecdotal sightings of people seeing things come out of the water.
Yeah.
And going into it.
Yeah.
So I think you have to. I think, and I guarantee you that most police maritime units are not going to be at all prepared for that incident.
Absolutely. I've actually got first-hand witness of maritime stuff, and I'm here in Spain with my mum at the moment. They have a lot of local police patrols for people arriving on boats and things like that, and the Coast Guard are very active. And I've seen a ball of light out over the waves here, and I can imagine if you're looking for unauthorized dinghies and things like that, that could be very distracting and certainly out of the ordinary for you. But you would be that first person that would be responding to those types of events.
Right. You can either respond or you may be the witness yourself of that event.
Yeah.
Okay. So after the incident is over, if it gets any kind of media coverage, police agencies have to be aware of the need for crowd control and for trespassing. And there's a case later in this presentation where the witness's farm was overrun over the years with people trying to get a look at it. And also, the law enforcement agency might get requests for interviews or information. This could go on for days, months, years. Now, my dad worked at a very mid-sized town police department here in California, and I think that the public information officer was a secondary duty. But if one of these incidents kind of happens, like the ones we're going to talk about later, big sighting gets a lot of publicity, they might be overwhelmed with it, for requests for information. You just got to keep that in mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, even if you want to know of the public interest, just look at the last congressional hearing. There was people queuing around the block, for a political event. So
I have an updated slide here. I made connection with Ryan Graves, who's really doing yeoman's work with his ASA, Americans for Safe Aerospace.
Mm-hmm.
And he says that they've got a connection with the FBI, and then if a law enforcement agency has an incident that is very compelling, that they can send it through his website to get forwarded onto the FBI.
Great.
Now, this is not, I have to say this to the lawyers, this is not an official endorsement of this presentation by ASA.
No.
But it's just a connection to them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something when my test audience kept asking, where do I send these reports to? And at the time, there was nowhere, but now there is some place that can get it to the government.
Yeah. Richard Dolan, a very famous historian on this, he said that it's only about 10 out of 1,000 sightings that ever make it to be reported in the first place, because obviously a lot of people are very reticent to say, I've seen, God knows what in the air or the sea. But then secondly, there's a huge amount of people that just don't know where to go with this. But like you said at the start, if the emergency services or the life preservation community are going to be the end of that funnel now, so this is going to be coming in more and more.
Right. So I got some suggestions for UAP investigation tools. There's some very good apps out there, like Flight Radar 24. There's a satellite tracker. There's even a maritime tracker if you're on a coastal law enforcement agency or have a naval unit, marine response unit, that you can use to kind of rule out certain things. That should I would assume that most officers are going to try to rule out the prosaic explanations from the more anomalous ones. Again, these are just suggestions. They're not putting any money in my pocket to promote them.
Yeah. No, that's great. It's definitely. I've not tried Skyview. I use one called Stellarium, and I've had it where I've seen the International Space Station go over, and I've been like, "Oh wow, oh my gosh!" And then I point to the app, and it's augmented, so it tells you what you're pointing your phone at, and it's like, yeah, space station, dude. So
they're really in high tech now.
Yeah. But there's great information because most of these are free as well. So
yes,
if an officer or whoever
or
is
they have, I think Flight Radar has ads if you don't pay them or whatever. So
yeah.
Okay, so one of the things I went into this when I first started doing my research, I thought Canada has some of the most compelling UFO stories of all time. Falcon Lake, Langenberg, Shag Harbor. I mean, the hits keep coming. The Yukon balloon, supposedly that was shot down. So I made connection with Chris Husing, who's a leading Canadian researcher, very much a gentleman. He was quick to help, and I thought, I didn't want to make this presentation more than about 35 minutes long, so I put in an appendix for more details for people who are interested. Because I really think that they're a role model for police UAP investigations.
Definitely.
So Chris Husing sent me a copy of this instruction manual from 1971 from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which is our national police agency, the famous Mounties. And what I think is very good about this instruction is that it basically informs all constables and the RCMP to investigate all sightings. Now, this came in a Cold War era, of course, and so there's probably a lot of defense implications for that. But they didn't have a choice. The Mountie out in Alberta didn't have a choice to investigate or not. He was mandated to investigate it, assess the credibility, but investigate it, and then pass reports to RCMP headquarters and Canadian Forces headquarters, which I think is just awesome. I wish we had something like that here in America, and maybe we will get there eventually. But yeah, I think that's pretty brilliant. So I've always told people, if you're trying to write your policy, you can start with this, half page, very, very succinct. And I don't think you'd be under any, there'd be no confusion if you were at a small RCMP station or even a big one. Now, they ended their investigation in 1995. Chris Husing told me that they ran out of budgetary money for it, and they didn't want to be seen by the taxpayers as funding quote-unquote trivial causes. But there was recently a national, one of their scientists in Canada did a report recently on UAP activity in Canada. And what was curious, I seem to recall seeing a quote on, I think it was CTV, that they're open to being, tasked again to investigate UAP if the government decides that. So I think that's a pretty open attitude. I commend the RCMP very much for that. Very
much so. And then, of course, we had Paul Hellyer, the former Canadian Defence Minister, coming out with an acknowledgement of the topic as well a few years ago. I think it's a conversation for another day, but it shows that they're taking it seriously.
And of course, we have some case studies now how the RCMP reacted. In Shag Harbor, I did another presentation on the 10 most compelling UFO incidents in my judgment. And Shag Harbor was pretty low at first, but the more I get to research this and talk to Chris Husing, the more this needs to be up at the top or close to it. And this happened in October 1967, where lights were seen in the sky above Nova Scotia. And people reported to their local RCMP detachment, who first thought the witnesses were drunk. I think that was one of the interviews I saw. But they sent several constables out to the harbor where they and an unspecified number of people watched this, I think it was yellow object, crash into the harbor. The RCMP commandeered local fishing boats. They went looking for any wreckage. They thought a plane had crashed, but they couldn't find any wreckage or bodies. They just found this strange, I think it was yellow or orange foam. And RCMP took interest. There's been some documents that have been uncovered by researchers in Canada where they thought this was a UFO. That's what the Canadian Forces thought, that this could be a real, actually UFO. Now, the story ends with the dispatch of their Atlantic Fleet diving unit, which is kind of like the Frogmen, who claimed they didn't find anything. Now, there's a whole other side of the story where they're supposedly, the object supposedly moved up the shoreline to a listening facility that the Canadians and U.S. Navy were running. But I don't put that in there because we don't have any real proof of that. It's all alleged and anonymous witnesses. We do have document trail for the Shag Harbor, wherever that object was that crashed into the harbor. We have a paper trail for that. We don't have one for the alleged, the second part of the story. And you can see it was front page headlines in Halifax.
Absolutely. And I think you've got to remember, this is 1967. This is 2 years before the moon landing. It's not like now when there's thousands of Starlink satellites and things falling out of the sky all the time. This was a very unusual event.
Yes, definitely. And the fact that so many witnesses saw it, and the RCMP, like I said, they had 3 officers from what I've researched that were there and watched this thing, sink below the waves. I think they saw it crash into the harbor and it just sunk.
Yeah.
This case is really, I don't know if you know this one that well, Tom, if you do jump in, but Langenberg I saw this on a History Channel documentary some years ago, where this is in 1974. September 1974 in Langenberg, Saskatchewan, and this farmer's son is on this tiller, and he suddenly sees these 5 dome-shaped objects hovering above his field, and he went up to approach them, which braver man than me, and I think they were rotating, did I say counterclockwise? Anyway, they were pushing, there was some kind of effluent that was pushing down the weed out there. Then he kind of freaked out, went back to the tiller and kind of just watched them for an unspecified amount of time. and then they all shot up and took off into the sky, leaving kind of these crop circles behind. Now, the family called up the local RCMP detachment, and a constable named Ron Fournier came out the next morning. Ron, can't read my own handwriting, Merrier, if I can say that correctly. I probably said it wrong. He came out to investigate, and his opinion was that while he didn't believe in UFOs, he said that whatever the objects were that made those crop circles, he believed the farmer and his parents. He said that they saw something. He said, I think his wording was, they came from the sky and they left by the sky. Now, one of the problems with this sighting, of course, is that in the years that followed, there were tons of trespassers to see where these crop circles were, which eventually faded over time. I think there was even a story of a Japanese or Australian light aircraft that landed near the field and dropped off what people wanted to see where this happened. So you can imagine what a burden that would be for a family that didn't ask for this attention, right?
Of course, yeah. Or any enforcement agency that are trying to investigate it. You're going to have people fanatically trying to get into your crime scene or event scene, whatever.
And I think that the RCMP did send more personnel out there, government personnel, to investigate this. We don't, again, you're left with the wondering what happened, but I've not heard any disparaging words about the witness. I do believe he saw what he saw. Now, whatever that is, another question. But I think the constables should be commended because he took him seriously. He didn't believe in the subject, still doesn't from the last interview I saw. But he doesn't doubt that whatever the farmer saw, that he saw it.
Yeah. Interesting. Fascinating.
And further reading, there was last year, the Major Cities Chiefs Association, which I never heard of, to be honest, until this document came out. But they did a reference guide of UAP, and it's kind of very similar to what I've done, but a little more detailed. They go into more case studies than I do. But that's definitely for further reading. One thing, Tom, I should have mentioned, I forgot to mention, so you can chop this up later if you want, is there's two things about investigating UAP that bothers the heck out of me from the media and from police departments, and you need to be aware of this. And the first thing, let me bring up my notes here. Give me just 1 second. So one of the most common things that you see TV stations, you see newspapers, the media, law enforcement, they'll say, well, we'll check with the local airport radar if they have anything on radar. The problem is there's two types of radar. There's primary radar, which is basically sending out a radio beam to an object that reflects it back to the receiver. And there's secondary radar, which depends on the ADS-B transponder. If you go to Flight 24, you can track all the aircraft that are traveling with an ADS-B or what do you call it, transponder.
Transponders, yeah.
So calling up the local airport and saying, do you have an unknown object on radar may not do anything because it may not be squawking the right transponder code. Now, I read up on that. What most American air traffic controllers will do is they will call out to an unknown object and ask it to make a turn to starboard or port and then see what object unknown on the screen, whether it does that or not. But that doesn't mean that it's been conclusive. And I see so many reports, like in the local news, where they'll say, "Oh, someone saw an unknown object off the shore of San Francisco. We called San Francisco International Airport. They have no unknown traffic." And then that's as far as the investigation goes. There's never any kind of follow up. So the agencies need to be aware of that. To just calling for help from the FAA is not going to be conclusive. And I think I was reading up here that there's 618 FAA air traffic control radars in the United States. Only 135 have primary radar.
Wow.
And there's a trend for smaller airports to go only to the secondary radar. Well, if it's an anomalous object, it's probably not squawking ADS-B.
No.
And so it won't show up on your radar screen. You won't see it. So let's say, let me back this a little bit and say, okay, let's say I'm in San Francisco and I see an object erratically moving or hits the water or whatever, and I say, call SFO and ask if they have it on radar. Well, if they're only looking at secondary radar, they're not going to see it. And that's a problem. And I think it's kind of lazy. It's lazy journalism by some of the TV studios do as well, too.
I agree. I can completely testify to that, certainly in the UK, because during the Lakenheath incursions, whatever they were last year, I was tracking live on ADSB, which is their website, which shows all the transponders. And the KC-35 Stratotanker was up doing racetrack patterns. There were plane spotters on the ground watching the F-15s all take off. And as soon as they take off, they were switching off all their transponders. So there were people seeing, jet engines and these fighter planes going around in the dark, but on the transponder side, everything was switched off. So it's certainly not a solid line of inquiry.
I mean, that's part of the problem with Malaysian Airlines. I think it was Flight 370, is that he turned off his transponder, the pilot, or whoever took over the plane, whatever that was, turned off the transponder, and that's what they had a hard time tracking. They didn't have primary radar set up for it.
Yeah, it's easy to think that a radar is, pinging like a sonar all the time and actually seeing what's physically there, and that's just not the case.
And also, low observability. I'm sorry. Low observability is definitely an issue too. I mean, some of these craft may be stealth or higher advanced stealth than we are aware of. So just saying that there's yes or no, and even if there's a yes, even if they call back and say, yeah, that object we don't know what it is, doesn't tell you what it is. It's an unknown, right?
No, I agree.
So just saying be cautious. I'm not saying not do it. One of the officers I talked to role play, he said, I called the FAA. As long as you're aware of the downside of the technology. And the other thing is that if you call the military, if you have a military base nearby, they've got a couple document incidents where they don't have any information for you, and they come out later with the story. And I can think of the Phoenix Lights. When those were originally reported, then they later came out that there were flares from A-10s over a training range. That story came out later, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't the initial story. And then the other thing is, hold on a second. The other incident is Stevenson, Texas. The one that was in 2008, I think it was. Stevensville? Is that
Stevensville,
right?
Yeah.
Sorry, my brain froze for a second. Stevensville, where initially they denied the presence of F-16s in the area. Then they said, we did have them later, from Carswell Air Force or a reserve base.
Yeah.
So you can't depend on the military for an instant answer either. You may get an answer eventually, but not maybe in your time frame. So they're just things. It's not to discourage officers from responding, but just to keep in the back of your mind.
Yeah, it's not going to be 100%. But it looks like you've had some great help here.
Yeah, I'll put you on that list also when I update this. I had an officer that I didn't want to use his name, where we role played all these scenarios, and he said, "Chris," he said, "I've never thought about this."
Yeah.
He said, my thinking was so away from that, but he says, you've got a point, that I might encounter somebody with this, with UAP incidents.
No, it's fantastic. It's good to see people coming together for a good cause, because, just like we were saying at the start, you could be anybody. It could be your first day on the job. You could be, fresh to a new department, and then all of a sudden something completely beyond the playbook happens. So,
well, it's like those officers in Las Vegas, where they get a report from 911 that says there's beings in the backyard, and these two cops are like, "What are we walking ourselves into at this point?"
Exactly. Regardless of what it actually was, whether it was an elaborate prank or something completely extraordinary, if there's no playbook, then that inserts a huge element of risk to the officers involved.
But one thing that's curious is that, I think after the 2017 article, there was an openness about reporting these objects. And I think that window, for other reasons, is kind of shut now. But to me, having your local law enforcement aware of this, like the RCMP was aware of it in the 60s and 70s and 80s, is that you've got data points that you can gather that, intelligence agency or government could put together to get a pattern, characteristics. And as we get this blurring of drones, UAVs, and UFOs, that's going to be even more important. Because you might get a call saying, "Hey, I've got an unidentified object flying over my house," and it could be a Russian surveillance drone, Chinese surveillance. I mean, we're in a whole new aerospace era at this point.
Absolutely right. God, you can buy a light aircraft from Amazon now, and with the amount of drones and things, the first responders, whatever the source of it, they're going to be dealing with a lot more fantastic looking technology falling out of the sky, and they're the people that get called out to it. So
they do. So one thing I told the officers in my trial run is, I said, There's no central repository in the government right now for police reports. But if there is ever going to be one, it's going to have to come from you guys in the field. It's going to have to come up from the bottom. It's not going to come down from the top.
No, in the UK, Gary Hazeltine, who was British Transport Police detective, and he's been a UFO investigator for years. He actually set up a database. I don't think it's still going now, but he said, just in Britain, there was that many people that were being called out to or experiencing firsthand UFO events, whatever they may have resolved to be, that he formed a database just so that they could collate their accounts and look for trends in the data. It's fascinating.
Well, I sent out request for information from the LAPD, the New York Police Department, Texas Rangers. I think I even emailed them, the London Metropolitan Police, and San Francisco Police. And I got the only response I got was from one major U.S. department where the guy, their public information officer, says, "We've never had those cases." And I thought, you've never had any unidentified object cases in the whole history of your department? I mean, how ridiculous a statement is that? But he didn't want to talk about it. It was a subject that he thought I was probably for crazies. I don't want to deal with it. Not going to talk about it. But come on, I mean, give me a break.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, when you're dealing with the unknown, ignorance can be very dangerous. For whatever the source of it, we can't afford not to discuss unusual and new events, can we? So
I agree.
Yeah. Well, I think you've done a fantastic job of that, mate, and I hope it does a lot of good for people out there. So,
and I'm willing to either send it to if an agency is interested, I can do a video conference for free. I'm not asking for any money from this. If they want a copy of it, just contact me at fact275@proton.me.
Yeah, I'll put your email up by the side at the end of the video so that people can see and get some.
And if they've got comments or feedback, or they have a case study that I should be aware of, I'm happy to hear it. And I'm not asking for any charge for this.
Fantastic, man! I think you've done a great job there, and it's a niche that, whether or not every department realizes they need it, it's only going to get bigger and bigger. So thanks again, Chris.
Well, thank you for hosting me. I really appreciate it.
Anytime.